Welcome to Women's Perspectives, the podcast that celebrates powerful women who help change the world and strive to shape our future. Throughout history, art has primarily featured the experiences of privileged groups, which pushes so many others, our global communities, into the shadows. Carrie Mae Weems is an incredible multidisciplinary artist who uses her work to question the role of history, dominant power structures, and uses portraiture to dive into questions of race, class, gender, and so much more. I'm excited for this conversation where we'll discuss how creativity is a powerful way to reclaim our agency. Welcome to you, the wonderful Carrie Mae Weems. After 3 decades of image making, you are one of the most highly regarded American artists.
As well I should be.
Yes, as you should be. And, some people may be most familiar with, of course, your kitchen table series. If they haven't seen it in a museum, they've seen it in a music video. In 2014, you became the first Black artist to have a retrospective at the New York's Guggenheim Museum.
True.
Which is quite a feat. And so, as somebody that has always loved photography, but particularly the power of visual arts, I was wondering for you, what was that moment when you were growing up when you realized the power that art held?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to join me. I've wanted to sit and talk with you for a long time. And I was so really happy that we finally met in a really good way about a year ago. And I had a lovely conversation with you and your mother one night that was so far-ranging and wonderful and deep. So it's a pleasure to be here with you as a voice of our younger generation, doing such important work, thinking about work in a very deep way. And it's gratifying. It's really gratifying to be a part of and to witness and to see.
Thank you.
I think I was really interested in the arts from a very, very young age. I started drawing and painting when I was about 6 or 7, and I spent a lot of time sort of obsessively making little drawings and characters.
Do you remember what your first drawings were of?
I think that they were like the Flintstones or something.
As they should be at 6 or 7.
Right? They were sort of cartoon characters and lots of swans. I learned how to draw them very early, and so I made lots of them. And I'm actually starting to make a few now in my, 70 years later. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew that it had something to do with a matter of expressive utterance. But it was actually later in my early, late teens, early 20s that a really horrible boyfriend gave me a really great camera.
Here's the horrible relationships, but the good things that
Exactly. But it was very important to me, and I immediately started making photographs, and I knew immediately that it was the thing that was going to carry me into the world.
And what were your first photos of?
Of a very good friend of mine. Of a very good friend of mine. And then, of course, of demonstrations in San Francisco. I was living in San Francisco at the time. So really learning how to use the camera and understanding that it was a way of capturing life in a very particular way, a way of describing life in a very particular way, and a way of inscribing life in a very particular way. And that I knew that it was going to be very, very important. And right around the same time, the same boyfriend came in one afternoon, woke me up from a nap, and showed me a copy of the Black Photographers Annual. And it introduced me to a whole group of artists and photographers who were working primarily in New York. They had started an organization called the Kamo Workshop. Roy DeCarava was a part of it, Lou Draper, Buford Smith, Azure Cowman, Ming Smith being the only female who was involved in the project. And that sort of really opened my mind to the possibility of what one could do with a camera. I knew that there was something important about what artists were doing. The thing that we did not know at that time, when I started making photographs, for the most part, is that there was no real history of Blacks involved in photography. There was no real history of women involved in photography. And so I knew that I really wanted to be a part of the field that was defining the field and what the field was in relationship to image making, whether it was painting and sculpture or photography or dance for that matter, and or music. So yeah, they became very, very interesting forms of understanding.
It seems like a interesting double task you had to take on of both the industry of photography and image making being an industry that has a lot to do with power dynamics when you have a primarily white male lens that people are looking through, but then in front of the camera also saying Black women as a subject haven't been studied as well. How did you start to really make sense of, like you're saying, make sense of your role in image making and what you wanted to capture and your choice to capture yourself as a part of your work?
I was very interested in deconstructions of power, of really questioning constructions of identity and how identities are constructed, knowing that quintessentially African Americans and women in many, many ways have been really left out of the larger narrative. I knew that there was a space for me. But it was a very difficult journey. So on the one hand, there was the historical material that I was dealing with, visiting photographers all over the country, collecting images and slides and materials about artists who no one knew of, for the most part, and at the same time, making my own work. I knew all of the guys, I knew all of the men, I knew all of the boys, both Black and white. I knew who they were, and I admired what they were doing in the field, but I knew that there was another space that they had not yet occupied. And then I came upon Kitchen Table.
Let's talk about the Kitchen Table series, because I think, especially now as we talk about the power of media, many times we're talking about works with overt, at times PSA-like messages on the role of race, on the role of politics. And I think Kitchen Table, just even as an audience member, has so much to say and yet is so intimate. And you wield such a particular ability to have such large conversations in really intimate ways, in ways where I can imagine somebody coming to view it for the first time may not fully understand or grasp the dynamics at play. And so how do you, when you're beginning to conceptualize a project like that, where does one begin?
It started through a maze of accidents. It was really wonderful. I'd already made several photographs in that space, at my kitchen table. The first one I made was of a man. The second one I made was maybe a child, but somebody in that space. And so there was something about the space, there was something about the light, there was something about all of these things that were sort of coming together. You know, I'm sort of looking, like I'm looking at it thinking, oh, this is a set. My home is actually a stage set. My kitchen is actually a set, right? And I can use this as a site of interrogation. So I started making these photographs. Of course, I was asking and reading and thinking about, all the questions that were related to feminism and the sort of great questions around, subjectivities and objectivity, how to frame oneself. I was teaching, working with all of my students. All of my students, for the most part, were white, young white girls who were photographing themselves in sort of very sort of coquettish ways where they were always sort of half hidden behind their hand.
Well, to take a moment to talk about the act of photographing yourself, I can imagine, I think generally many women here, especially Black women, that we take up too much space or are made to feel that way.
Made to feel that way, of course. Since we take up none.
Subliminally or directly, that message is passed along. And so I remember one of the things that impacted me immediately was seeing you in frame in such a clear way. And I can imagine if you're an artist already facing questions about why your subject matter is Black, what was it like to then say, well, why is your subject matter yourself? How did you answer that question for yourself or to whoever may have asked?
I think in a lot of ways I really never thought of it as being me. I think of her as being a character, a sort of a character who has the ability to carry an enormous amount of weight. And so she is the personification and the embodiment of a whole set of contested ideas that land on her body and in that space. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the piece actually functions so well, and that it speaks across any number of cultures. And that it's become sort of like this sort of reflective mirror for any number of cultures in relationship to family identity, the relationship between men and women, the battle between men and women, the question around monogamy, polygamy, the question around, children and one's relationship to children, to friendships, to love. All of those things are the most basic of human aspirations and desires. So it brings us close to the work, I think, in a very profound way.
Mm-hmm. And what you said of you being, in many ways, a reflective material also challenges the conversation you were having yesterday, which is, what does it mean to think of a Black woman as the universal standard in a way that we've thought about
absolutely
whiteness as a universal? And so it's interesting to see this Kitchen Table series is doing the same work of saying, all I have to do is exist to be relatable. And while you're still showing the specifics of your life, it's interesting when you're talking about the global impact it's had of sharing the specificities of your experience, which is something so many times anybody of a marginalized community can be dissuaded from doing, which is getting specific.
I think, this is such an interesting question, and it's one of the questions I actually have for you that I'd really love to talk about. I'm not sure if you know that before the pandemic, I started working on a project called Scenes and Takes. Scenes and Takes is really about the story of a woman who arrives, an African-American woman who arrives a little too early in Hollywood. And then she begins to look at the emergence of young people like you, of faces like you. There are any number of television shows, any number of films now where African Americans are present in every conceivable way. What do you think has changed? And do you have a sense that things have changed in a profound and dynamic way in relationship to the way people of color are presented in film and television?
It's such a great question. One thing that I resonated with or thought about as soon as you said it was the idea of you stepping into photography and there really having been no legacy or lineage to tap into in regards to Black people and Black women in photography. And I think the biggest difference when I think of my own career is the fact that I very much stepped into a lineage of generations of work done before me. And when I think of Blackish or Grownish and the function they have, in many ways, when the shows first came on, they were lauded for being this major accomplishment, but I think we were all very aware that this was kind of the renaissance of Black TV, emphasis on in that we have seen iterations of a Black family on television before, and that Blackish was only made possible by all of those iterations of the Jeffersons, etc., having been on TV before, giving us the space to tell these other stories. And so that, I think, made a really big difference in terms of our experience on television, because I think about me as a young actor, I was encouraged to share my political view because that's the work the show was doing. But at the same time, I still had peers on other shows that were being penalized for being too vocal, etc. And so in many ways, I think the connection between Black television and media and Black activism and the presence of actors and activists made shows like Blackish and Grownish feel more sustainable, less temporary, yet and still, I feel like we talked about this briefly, there is this feeling constantly that I feel of our impermanence, in that our position here isn't solidified or something that I can rely on. On the one hand, it's important to celebrate the fact that I do feel like leaps and bounds have been made in terms of what stories we can tell. The fact that I am seeing directors and actors and writers constantly bring new stories to screen that we wouldn't have seen decades ago, yet and still, it is always top of mind to say, okay, well, is the infrastructure changing to reflect a more inclusive infrastructure or an equitable infrastructure? And how do we not get too distracted by what's happening on screen and pay attention to what's happening off screen?
Right. Across it, right? Across the field, across the plateau.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that's interesting, I have one more question.
Yes.
One more question.
Please.
In terms of like voice,
Mm-hmm.
who are some of the people that you are most interested in at the moment, who are directors or producers, not necessarily actors, but who are directing in the field, who are producing the kinds of work that you really think should be made?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, in terms of work that people are familiar with, but I think is really powerful, seeing Issa Rae on Insecure really, I think was really magnificent. Like, I watched it while it was coming out, but I think I had binge watched it right before my senior year of college. And it was so fun to rewatch because I think what she taps into and what we were even talking about was that specificity of Black experience. But what I particularly love, the reason I bring up Insecure is that is a show anchored in such spectacular Black women doing things in their field. So I point to the director, Melina Mastoukas, is one of my all-time favorites. And she has had such an impact in the music industry as somebody that has crafted iconic imagery for the Knowles sisters and many artists, but then has stepped into and ushered shows like Insecure on. And then you have stylists like Shiona. And so what I love about the team Issa Rae has created is that everybody that participated in that show in their own respective way has gone on to continue to interrogate and push forward different images of Black women. And so, yeah, that's a show and a group of people I think of.
I think they're really fascinating.
Almost immediately.
And what about Lena?
I love Lena. And I think Lena is also a wonderful example of community building. I mean, we met in a room that in many ways exemplifies the power of community, being surrounded by so many incredible artists in their field. But Lena is that person that, I've called personally when we've had a question about, okay, how have you maneuvered this as a writer, as a showrunner?
That's really great. I think she's really special.
We've had conversations on this podcast before, particularly about museums and curators and the role of curators, and thinking about how many times there is the ideal space of creation and the reality of creation that's contingent on grants, space, community, opportunities.
Absolutely.
And do you feel like the two are correlated? This feeling that we haven't yet hit a space in which we can truly, continuously, deeply examine the nuance of our existence and the way art operates as an industry and as an institution.
Yes, it's kind of fascinating because if you really kind of look at, there was the pandemic and then there was the murder of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. It had deep implications for what happened in the entertainment business, and it had deep implications for what happened in the art business as well, in the art space. And what happened within the art space is that hundreds of people were sort of let in. Mm. And any number of institutions said, well, we have to have a Black show. And in having this Black show, it was just this sort of grab, right? It wasn't this thoughtful, engaged process of understanding. It was a grab. But I think we learned something deeper, which is this is serious work, and that serious work actually takes time. Either you care, and it's a part of your deepest space, and you bring that forward in all the work you do, or you don't. It's either you care or you don't. And you care for the right reasons, not because he died, right? Because the world is such a much more dynamic and interesting place with you in it. with multiple voices in it, with a cacophony of sound, of position, of attitude, and of great, great, great skill. The institutions now are, trying to catch up with themselves. And they're now trying to figure out how to welcome in a whole new group of historians and image makers and curators and administrators and programmers who have not been there before. And all of that is really going to take time because essentially they've not been really trained, right? They've not really been trained. There's only a handful. It's a very interesting space and time to be in. It's really a great time. If you really care, it's really a great time to be a part of all of this in terms of cultural making, cultural producing. I mean, what's possible and what's coming, I think, out of all of this is really quite special. And that no longer is a program or a grab, but is really based on the complexity and the depth of what people are actually doing in their work and in their lives. I think it's going to be really quite fascinating.
There's so much to be said and just to intake and listen to. But I really love this idea that you've boiled it down to its most simple, if you really care. And I think it is such a good question to ask of the world around us, but of ourselves. And you've talked about your work coming from a space of compassion, and I feel as though compassion and care are so closely linked. What are your thoughts? Can people learn to care? Are you thinking of care as something innate within us?
We are all human, and we all understand that. I think that, a lot of what separates us is simply fear.
Mm-hmm.
But I always feel that, the thing that most interests me most, regardless, is that I have this sort of deeper hope that the human spirit does ultimately triumph. And that even within all this darkness, I see all of these glimmers of hope everywhere, reflecting back at me, saying that it is changing, it is coming, the wind of change has arrived, right? And how we sort of usher it across the finish line is the thing that is exciting and rewarding. And we do that when we are functioning in the deepest human part of ourselves, crawling towards our complex humanity. And so recognizing that gives me, I think, a great sense of ease, a great sense of understanding, a great sense of purpose, a great sense of hope, and a great sense that I know that the change is here.
I love what you're saying about fear, and going back to this interesting conversation on the role of art and the role, our own responsibility to the form. What do you feel like the role of image making, art, media is in dismantling fear? There is an ongoing conversation about, is it my responsibility, let's say as a Black and Iranian woman, to make you less afraid of Black and Iranian women? Who holds that responsibility? Is my responsibility just to be as authentic as possible, and your responsibility is to be as curious as possible?
No, I think that those are really great questions. It's dual. I think the first responsibility of art is really to yourself. Like, what is it that you need to do, right? So if you are really sort of, in sort of looking at, your role as a Black Iranian woman, really it's looking at your role as a Black Iranian woman. Well, what is that? What is the complexity of that? And working out that complexity, and it's your authenticity and the way that you deal with it and the integrity that you bring to it that allows me, the viewer, to get close to it, right? And thereby get closer to myself, right? That you give me permission by your openness, by your ability to control the narrative. You allow me to know me. Through knowing you. I mean, that's really sort of like the beauty of the reflection, right? That you allow me to know you. And therefore, you allow me to know myself in the deepest possible way, in a way that no other form actually gives us. So whether we're talking about literature or painting or sculpture or film, the reason that we participate is because we're learning something about ourselves.
It's such a beautiful way to think about it, because oftentimes in this dialogue of responsibility, it feels like, oh, my responsibility is to an audience or something outside of myself. And there have been so many questions that, are you going to bear more burden on marginalized communities to say, okay, now do this extra work? But the way you're saying this is it's a really powerful point to say, what if we commit to ourselves so deeply?
Absolutely.
And what I need as an individual,
absolutely,
which is how we can do the dual work of the healing and the work that we need.
That's why the work is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
But even feeling empowered enough to say that my specificity has something to offer isn't something that many people have been told.
Right. Yes. Which becomes, in a lot of ways, it is our burden as people of color, because we were always put in the group. We're not seen as individual. We've been historicized as a group, right? Mm-hmm. But within that, of course, there is great troublemaking. It's really wonderful troublemaking.
Thank you does not capture how grateful I am to be able to sit with you today.
You're very special. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you so much for giving us your time and your thoughts. I hope this is one of many, but I'm so grateful to be able to sit and know that these conversations get to be shared, because I know that they will sit with many people that I'm sure are mulling over the same questions.
Oh, I hope so. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.